All right, if you have your Bibles, go to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. And if you've been with us, we have covered a lot. In the last two lessons, I've given you exposure to the four major views of end times. And this is a building block for, I would say, more complex views that we're going to run across as we move forward. And I look at it this way: if you get something out of this the first time, the next time you go through Revelation, you will get something more out of it. And not everything is going to be absorbed the first time. And if you go, man, I don't think I understood all of that, it's okay. Take as much in as you take in, and then the next time, Revelation tends to grow in people. So please, if you can, be here for each lesson or listen to each lesson, and we're going to get into this. Most pastors, when they teach the book of Revelation or the end times, they teach their view. And I realize it's a new idea for many, especially that if you imagined or were surprised that there were other views of the end times. If you were like me and you grew up in the Left Behind generation, it was the only answer for Revelation's timeline. So I've been introducing these views to you, and this will probably be the last week I just do a quick introduction, but I want to do it in a visual way. I found a really great picture of the four views. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but I want to explain this to you really quick. And also, if you're in the Facebook group page that we started, I'm going to put it out there for you to have as well. And if you're not a part of the group page and you want to be, just let me know. So this was a great depiction of the four views. And if you look to the left, you will see what's called the preterist view. It's the idea that all of Revelation happened in the past. The partial preterist believes that the last three chapters of Revelation haven't happened yet, but everything else is happening. We're just waiting for the return of Jesus. To the middle left is the historicist view with its focus on Revelation over all of church history. To the middle right is the idealist view, which its focus of Revelation is the ongoing spiritual struggle and the lessons as we look at the Lamb's reign. And to the right is the futurist view. And admittedly, this is the view I hold, probably with a loose grip, with its focus of Revelation on the coming tribulation and the second coming of Jesus. And while these views are not cohesive with each other, they all accent one major message: that Christ has come. He's reigning, He's working through history, and He will come again. And we can see the views across this statement as almost as a bigger picture of the end times. So with that, let's recap last week. This is Matthew 24 so far. What we got in the first 14 verses is simply this: the temple is going to be destroyed. The warning to not be led astray by false messiahs or false teachers from Jesus to His disciples. Thirdly, the tribulation and birth pains that are coming, verses 6 through 9. And verses 10 and 12, that many would fall away from the faith. Number 5, the endurance to the end, that he who endures to the end will be saved, in verse 13. And last point of 6, preach the gospel. Now, by the way, I do think it's rather interesting that I taught about birth pains last week and we have a baby. Coincidence? I don't know. So last week we ended on birth pains. But today, before we move on, I want to highlight the Great Commission from an end times perspective. Jesus gives the timing of His return in verse 14. And He says this: "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." Think about this for a second. He didn't give us a day or a month or a year. He said this is when the end is going to come. And look, I find myself just this walking contradiction sometimes. That if everybody hears the gospel, Jesus comes back. And I hear people longing for the return of Jesus. And they've admitted to me that they don't share the gospel. But Jesus says when everybody hears, the end will come. And this is what we learn from Matthew 24. Jesus' return is not a date, it's a mission completed. Jesus wants every person to hear the gospel, then he will come back. In fact, Scripture says that hell was meant for the devil and his angels, not people. He wants all possible to be saved, to come to a saving knowledge and of the cross of Jesus, the gospel, the salvation given to us. And this is what we studied last week. And it leads us to today. Today we're going to talk about, I guess for the lightest way possible I could say this, we're going to talk about the Antichrist and his buddies. But stay with me on this one. It's going to get a little dark for a bit, okay? I'm going to read verses 15 through 28, and I'm reading from the ESV. Verse 15 says this. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Let's stop here. So when looking at these passages, we're going to return to our questions from last week. When will the temple be destroyed? What is the sign of Jesus' coming? And what is the sign of the end of the age? Jesus mentions Daniel in the first verse of our reading today. This abomination that causes desolation is ultimately the Antichrist. However, in Daniel and Jesus' words in Matthew, I believe God is warning his people across generations of a future event that will challenge the followers of Jesus. And the way the Bible language works is that it will often give us what I call these signposts. In practice, biblically, a signpost is an event that happens in the past, but points to a future event that replicates what happened in the past. So in other words, what initially happened becomes a signpost to something greater. Let me give you some examples of this to show you that I'm not making this up. What we understand about the rainbow in Genesis 9:12 through 17, that God's promises never again to flood the earth, and he does this as a picture of mercy triumphing over judgment. It's a covenantal promise. And this covenant promise would happen in both the Old Covenant and then the Old Testament and even the New Covenant. We get this introduction of covenants that repeat themselves. One that's more blatant and specifically referenced again and again in the New Testament. I only gave you one New Testament reference, but the Passover lamb. So the Passover lamb, and during the time of the Exodus, when that was happening, the Passover lamb saved the firstborn of the Israelites in Egypt. But what the New Testament is clear of is that the Passover lamb is a signpost to Jesus Christ. He is our Passover lamb, saving humanity from sin. The tabernacle is a signpost that God dwells with his people in the wilderness. And so in the wilderness, when they would get up and move, they would pack everything and they would take the tabernacle with them. What happens in the New Testament? We're given the Holy Spirit. And over the course of time, no matter where we go in our lives, the Spirit of God dwells within us and goes with us. The tabernacle is a signpost to this New Testament reality. And the one that Jesus references directly is the bronze serpent. That in the Israelites in the desert, they were being poisoned by serpents. And a serpent is put up on a pole, and if they would look upon this serpent, they would be healed in the Old Testament. Jesus specifically mentions the cross and this bronze serpent as this signpost of what he's doing. The venom of death in the Old Testament is sin conquered by Christ in the New. So the signpost repeats itself. And I could give you many more. The Exodus and language in the New Testament describes Christians on an exodus from the world, for example. Jonah was a signpost of the resurrection. And I'll stop there, but you can kind of see where all these examples exist of what a signpost is. Something happening in the past that points to a future event. And likewise, I believe the abomination that causes desolation that we hear in Matthew and even in Daniel are signposts pointing to the ultimate and final Antichrist. So let's revisit Daniel's signpost. And if you're with us in Daniel, some of this you may remember, but I think it's important to understand as we look at the Antichrist. Because what happens is when we look at these signposts, we get a picture of what the reality will be when the Antichrist tries to snuff out faith, to snuff out believers, to try to break the gospel of God even though he fails. So in this, the purpose of the abomination that causes desolation as a signpost is to prepare us for what is coming in the end times. Daniel talks about the abomination that causes desolation 3 times in his book in the Old Testament. And if you were with us when we covered Daniel, there was an Antichrist figure. His name was Antiochus IV. He literally was this abomination that caused desolation in the temple. So in this case, Antiochus, this man, he was a signpost to the words of Jesus here in Matthew. So let's make sure we understand the term. What is an abomination that causes desolation? And the person who fits this title is someone who would do a very horrible thing in the eyes of God. So think of it this way. The abomination is someone committing an act detestable to God. And that act causes desolation. So this person, actually this word desolation, it means devastation, destruction, depopulation. So the abomination that causes desolation in the eyes of God in an Old Testament sense is the person who commits this horrible act against God's temple and God's people. And he would see it that way. So in Daniel, a leader by the name of Antiochus, he was the king of the Seleucid Empire. He was this Antichrist leader. Now, as I describe him, listen to the apocalyptic nature of these words. Because Antiochus, he wanted to see the Jews led away from God and would do anything to make that happen. And scholars see the words of Daniel immediately pointing to this man. So Antiochus, the first thing he did when he started to attack the Jews. Again, think of our future too as we read through this. Antiochus, he burns the copies of the Torah that they had. He forbade them to obey it. He sold the high position twice to Greeks. So they had Greek high priests in the temple. If you know anything about the Old Testament, imagine how problematic it would be for a Greek high priest teaching Greek ways in God's temple. That would have been horrendous. So Antiochus, he stops the sacrifices. He sets pagan altars in the temple so that the Jews couldn't sneak in and honor their God. It would have defiled the temple and God would have declared it needed to be cleansed first for them to be able to offer their sacrifices. So Antiochus stops all the sacrifices. And it gets worse. To make them unclean, he forces the Jews to eat pork and sacrifice pigs on the holy altar to spit in the face of the God of the Jews. Then he outlawed circumcision. And then what he would do is he would have soldiers and come check to make sure and enforce this law. He gave them the ultimatum to sacrifice to Zeus or die. And what we know from Antiochus, he killed over 40,000 Jews in 2 days. So Antiochus, he has a God complex. He gave himself the name of Epiphanes. So he was known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And this word epiphany simply means God manifested. So in other words, he says, I am Antiochus from God. God in flesh. Sound familiar, right? For he claims to be a manifestation of the gods. He saw himself as Zeus incarnate. I hope I put this in here, but I think I did. Yes, this is his coin. If you remember this from our study, if you look on to your right, those are actually letters around him sitting there holding this idol. What it said on the back of the coin was, King Antiochus, God manifest, bearing victory. And some of you, if you don't remember this or don't know this, what he's holding in his hand is the goddess of victory called Nike. And I know some of you are thinking shoes right now, so I did the research. Nike named their company after this Greek goddess. So I'm not telling you don't wear Nike, but what I am saying, know where it comes from. And the book of 1 Maccabees, it's not in the Protestant Bible, but it's in the Catholic Bible. The reason it was excluded was that there were historical errors found within the writings of 1 and 2 Maccabees. Also, these writings did not pass the Jewish infallibility test, though most of history within this book is really close, if not sound. And this is considered an extra biblical text. In other words, I'm going to show some verses from 1 Maccabees of Antiochus and his impact. But this is not what I would consider a divinely inspired book. It doesn't meet the requirements of all the other biblical texts. I'm simply quoting a history book here. And so we're looking at a signpost today. A person like the Antichrist pointing to a future Antichrist. And I'm going to read 2 sets of verses to you, and they go this way. This is 1 Maccabees 1. And the king sent letters by messengers, and that king is Antiochus. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priest, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. One more reference for you. This scrolling down to verse 54 here. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, and the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah, and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food, or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. These are some chilling, almost apocalyptic verses, right? So Antiochus, he replaces the Jewish altar with an altar to Zeus and sacrificed a pig on it in 168 BC. Now the Maccabees, what they do is they revolt from all of this, and they revolt in such a way that this time Antiochus loses to Israel in 165 BC. And in December of 165 BC, they have to go through and they purify the temple, and the offerings were restored. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but every year the Jewish people celebrate the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, because of this event. And I love the picture of this, that there is tribulation and there's celebration. And that pattern is going to repeat itself even at the end of time. But what a dark day in their history. Imagine a leader rising today committing these kinds of acts of abomination. Imagine people coming in and turning church buildings and services into places of idolatry, forcing believers to choose between faith in Jesus and living. The imagery of a mother hung with her child around her neck still haunts me today. And the Bible warns us that these kinds of events are coming. Now, for me as a futurist, I see Antiochus, and now we're going to look at Nero and Domitian in detail. These all three, to me, are incredible signposts of a coming Antichrist. And I believe Jesus was warning his generation while alive on earth and warning us to keep watch in the days ahead. So let's look at Nero really quick, just in more detail than last week. Nero, he began the first state-sanctioned persecution of Christians, the first in Roman history. Some Christians were literally nailed to crosses. He encouraged people to hail him as divine statues, calling him Zeus reborn, Apollo the musician. Coins that show rays around his head, which were symbols of deity in Roman days. And then with Nero, other victims were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were covered what was called at that time pitch. It was fuel, and they would take Christians and they would put them on these tall poles and burn them to death, and he would call them candles. It's where we get the idea today, unfortunately, of Roman candles. And so they would burn in his garden, and they would keep these burnt Christians would keep his garden lit at night. And Nero declares himself this divine performer. I mean, imagine being this musician and singer, and you force senators to watch you sing and act for hours. I like the wording forced here. They more than likely did not want to listen to him sing and act for hours. But as I mentioned last week, Nero had committed suicide because Rome ultimately turned against him. And he dies from this self-inflicted neck wound. And one of his final words that were recorded in history, and he says this. He says, "What an artist dies in me." A little bit of pride there, right? Just a little. So Nero saw himself as a divinely inspired person and performer. And though he never directly claimed a deity for himself, he allowed others to call him a deity. He always alluded to it. Shortly after him, Emperor Domitian was another signpost of the Antichrist. There's this turmoil in Rome when Nero takes his life. 3 emperors try to take the throne, and they're either killed or exiled, the next 3. And then Domitian is the one that sticks. And unfortunately for Rome and for Christians, Domitian was also an Antichrist figure, and he demanded worship. He expanded emperor worship throughout the empire. He demanded them to address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Dominus, it's Deo, sorry. So in other words, he kind of altered his name a little bit. And it's like, hi, my name is so-and-so, and you go, you're David, right? And I go, no, call me Lord and God. He would probably run, as you should. But he heard this. He forced people, and he spoke this, and they heard, and they had to call him this or die. Not just Christians, but everybody in the empire. Refusal was treason, punishable by death. And so for Christians, they would not cave. Much like the Jews with Antiochus. They wouldn't cave because there was only one Lord and God, and that was Jesus. So the persecution of Christians intensified. And the reason why we think that Revelation happened under Domitian is because Asia Minor received most of that persecution. Asia Minor is where the 7 churches that are in Revelation 2 and 3 that was recorded. So the persecution actually matches the writing of Revelation. And then Christians, they would refuse calling him God. And it's interesting because I've run across this more than once. The Romans would call Christians atheist because we didn't worship Roman gods. And they would accuse us of treason. Persecution would spread as a result. And the early church fathers record John as exiled to Patmos for this reason under Domitian's reign, that he would not cave. Now I've given you 3 Antichrist figures, 3 signposts that I've shared with you today. And I don't believe any of them were the actual Antichrist. They were signposts. They represented the spirit of Antichrist. And with all of this, you can look at all 3 of the men and you can see this apocalyptic nature of their rule. And I believe this, that every generation has leaders who exalt themselves while suppressing the truth of God. You know why I think it is so important to keep your spiritual eyes opened along with political eyes? People would look at Domitian, for example, as a successful political figure. He did all these good things politically for Rome. But at the same time, he denies Jesus in such a way that history records him as an Antichrist figure. And I think the danger is we can get so lost in our politics today that someone could be good for the nation, but utterly and completely against Jesus. And we have to keep our spiritual eyes open. Have you noticed lately that people calling themselves gods or goddesses, whether in life, in movies, music, have you noticed that's become more commonplace? Am I the only one that's noticed that? People calling themselves goddesses, gods. It's become normal. Society doesn't worship emperors anymore, but they have found people to worship. So now this is what I had to sit still and stop everything I was doing this week after what I'm about to tell you next. So I went to Google and I asked the now AI-assisted search engine this question. And after I got my answer, I wrote the exact question down so you can go ask it if you don't believe me. I asked, who would you say today is considered a modern god or goddess? I thought I was going to get a list of names. Here was the answer that the Google AI gave me. In modern culture, the concept of a god or goddess has shifted from divine, omnipotent beings to human icons who embody extreme levels of talent, influence, or beauty, often worshipped through fandom, social media, and celebrity culture. Don't read past this. What are we doing today? We are redefining what it means to be God. It's shifted from the divine to human icons. That should be enough to scare all of us. Or at least have our eyes open. I'm not afraid. But that is, any one of you can type my question and you'll get that answer. That our perception of God is now changing in modern culture. From AI itself, to actors, singers, political leaders, we look like a generation trying to fashion an idol for ourselves. One of the most respected apologists, he'll fry your brain every time you hear him talk, his name is John Lennox. And when he has got a book on Revelation and AI, and one of the things he says in the book about AI is that humanity is rebuilding the Tower of Babel through this software. And I thought that was rather interesting. So look, I don't mean for my next statement to be hyper charismatic, but let's be honest. The spirit of Antichrist is alive and well in our generation. There are many signs around us happening that seem to be pushing us forward to a time where Jesus says in verse 21 that there will be great tribulation that has not been from the beginning, not now, nor ever will be. To the point of where in verse 22 that if God doesn't intervene during the tribulation, no human would be saved. In one of my commentaries, there's a German common language version of this verse. And when you translate it into English, it says this: if God had not cut short the time of terror. It is a visual of the ministry of the Antichrist. The distress of the days coming upon the earth are unparalleled in human history. But Jesus inserts this caveat when the days are cut short. He cuts the days short for a reason. But I think this is our promise, that the mercy of God still reigns even in the greatest suffering. And the commonalities of these Antichrist men are going to continue. Worship is exclusive to God, yet these men wanted to be worshipped as God. They attacked the temple, they attacked God's people, and they mocked God by an all-out assault on His people. The premise is a Roman one in a sense. The persecution, murder, and injustice towards God's people will be one where the Antichrist, portraying himself as God, will be considered a powerful deity through conquest. Yet God's power, God, the reality of God, transcends the idea of just power. Revelation does reveal God's ultimate power and victory, but it makes the point to reveal who God is and at least one sense of what it means to be God. There's be many things I think that are beyond human understanding of who God is. But see, in Revelation, not only is God's power revealed, but His characteristics of holiness, faithfulness, even in suffering and mercy, and His ultimate redemption of believers. We see all these additional ideas that make God who He is. A Roman or Greek God may follow man-made patterns of power and conquest, but they are not a God who could save a human soul or wash someone's sins clean or is inherently righteous. Some of the Greek gods were horrendous. In the island of Crete, the belief was that Zeus would come down in the form of a man and he would have intercourse with their women and go back up to the heavens. He was considered devious. So God not only loves, but He is the greatest expression of love, the greatest source of love, of righteousness, of strength, of perseverance, holiness, peace. And God is not only great because He cannot be defeated. He's great because He cannot be corrupted. This is a concept foreign to man-made idols, but featured in the character of God. So there's a shift in verse 23. Most translations begin with the word then, And Jesus declares a warning of these false messiahs and false prophets that will rise. See how the four views we've been talking about consider this passage. The partial preterists would say that these were people claiming to be messiahs before 70 AD. Josephus records messiah figures leading followers into the desert or leading some followers to the rooftops to experience this divine rescue with failing at the same time. All these movements died off. The historicist, that throughout church history, this was Jesus' warning of ongoing deception, that the church must be versed in the Word and committed to the gospel. The idealist, that any ideology that replaces Christ's lordship is reflective of the spirit of Antichrist, and as Christians we must reject this spirit, these efforts. And from my standpoint, again, I think I agree with all of these in this sense. For the futurists, these warnings are events taking place in the Great Tribulation, where the Antichrist and false prophet will perform false signs to deceive many. So in these four views, there's a contributing message that's happening here. That though the preterist looks only to the past, which I disagree with, we're still given these examples of the damage a false Messiah can unleash on the earth. The historicist reminds us that deception is alive and well in history and today. The idealist reminds us to hold to the genuine gospel of Jesus when other ideologies are present. And the futurist reminds us we should continually be in preparation for days that are coming that are difficult beyond our imagination. Even if you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, birth pains are going to get worse. Get ready. And Jesus clears up the confusion about His return in the last two verses of our reading in this section. He gives two examples of how visible His actual return will be. And both examples tell us to look to the sky. Lightning shoots across the sky. It represents not only the visibility, but at the time, the power of God. But then the vultures hovering over the corpse represents those who are condemned in judgment. And we get this dual presentation of the return of Jesus. Now, growing up, I'm going to come back to this vultures verse. I was taught 2 or 3 different perspectives on this one verse, and we'll come back to it later when we talk about the rapture. So with this, the person who sees these things, they can look up and they can see the birds of prey circling. They can see the lightning and they know that Jesus is coming. And both examples represent the power of God's return and the depth of despair and judgment. So let's look at verse 29. I'm not going to read many verses here. We're going to stop on verse 31. Verse 29 says this. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And He will send out His angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather His elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So let's stop here. Now, before I finish this, I want you to understand something. Scholars believe the book of Revelation itself was written somewhere in the 90s AD, 96 AD. Many Christians who heard these words of Jesus, for many of them, maybe some of Paul's writings as well, this is all they had of the end times. And when you look in the first century, they weren't awaiting a 7-year tribulation like we do today. They thought Jesus was coming back any second. And when you read the verbiage of the letters in the New Testament, you will see it. They didn't have the information that we have today. So they're looking at this, and in a sense, they're frightened, but yet at the same time rejoicing and trusting God and trusting in His promises. And these 4 simple verses much more powerful of a visual than we realize. Now, I live in Eagleville, and when I take our dog Cooper out at night, it's so dark in the backyard. The one thing I try to do is I actually try to find the brightest star. It's a habit I've had since I was a kid. It's probably cheesy, but I look for the brightest star in the sky. And each night I'll find it in a different place. When I was in the city, I could not see the stars like I can see them now because of the light pollution. And so, to me, when I look up at the sky, there's a brightness about it, especially when the moon is out. It is much clearer in the country. You literally can see the moon shining across your yard when it's on full display in some nights. And see, and I understand this because when I was in Iraq, the moon, in a desert storm, the moon didn't come out until 2 in the morning, and I could put my hand in front of my face and not see my hands. That's how dark it was. I think this is how deep the darkness is going to be, the way Jesus is saying this. But then there's going to be a light. And not just any light. It will be the sign of the Son of Man. Now, scholars are not sure of the sign. Some actually believe it's the glory seen in the temple. Others think it might be a symbol like maybe the fish, which was the first symbol of Christianity, potentially the anchor, or even a cross. The sign will be apparent enough to cause the tribes of the earth to mourn. Also, it seems to be visible and understandable enough for God's people to understand this sign. Zechariah kind of contributes to the conversation here. He says this in 12:10. He says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day they will recognize the Messiah that most Jews still reject to this day." And this moment is going to be one of either celebration or mourning. And those who rejected Christ, they will mourn, they will hold regret, and understand what they have ignored and what they've done. Others, what Revelation records is that they're going to shake their fist at God when this happens. But man, for me, I think this is like this cinematic scene. Imagine standing outside in your backyard and all of the lights of the universe shut off. Let's just say it's the middle of the day. Jesus says in Matthew 24, the sun, the moon, the stars, off. Complete darkness after facing the most horrible season in human history. And in this deep darkness, it's going to seem hopeless for a time or a moment. And with the lights out, the dust of the tribulation settling, we're going to see a light in the sky. The sign of Jesus in the sky. One author, when I was reading about these last 4 verses, and I wish I could give him credit, but he's anonymous. He says, creation dims as the Savior shines. So Jesus coming to claim those who belong to him. According to what Jesus says in Matthew 24, a trumpet sounds, and those who are his are gathered by angels to him. This moment is a scene where everything is about to change. And I pray it is one we long for until it happens. So quickly, let me bring this all together. And someone asked me this a long time ago, but I want to answer this question again. Why would God allow for the tribulation to happen? That was asked of me. Why would he allow the deception, the death, and the destruction? Here's what we know about the tribulation itself. It's not a random event. It is a necessary and purposeful act of God where both his justice and mercy are on full display as creation is purified. In the end, we see this purification. New bodies, new heaven, new earth. The seed of sin that began with Adam is cut off entirely, and Christ The second Adam recreates everything. So in Daniel, we also see this, and let's look at an Old Testament perspective of this. And this is about the 70 weeks of Daniel, and don't get too hyper-focused on that. We're going to come back to it. But understand what I have here highlighted. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. Why, in other words, why is there a tribulation? To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy place. So, even though we're going to come back to this verse later, I want to introduce this to you when we talk about the tribulation. What we see here is the end of sin, atonement, everlasting righteousness as a result. And it says here to seal both vision and prophet. What that means is every vision and every prophecy comes to fulfillment. And we see this happening in Jesus, except for the promises that He has left for us. And the promises of and the prophecies of the end times. That's what's left in the Bible. And to anoint a most holy place, New Jerusalem comes down from heaven. We'll talk about that at the end of Revelation. The tribulation is God's final step in His redemptive plan to judge all evil, to finalize His grace and mercy on all believers. In other words, we'll see the full extent of it, and to establish His kingdom and fulfill His promises. God allows for the tribulation because He has an ultimate plan for those who are His and for those who are evil and for those who are not His. We must trust and be willing to trust His plan and His promises. So if I look at aspects of our four views, we can see how each contributes to God's ultimate destiny for believers. The preterist, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD assures us that the promises of Jesus will never fail. Jesus prophesies of the destruction of the temple. We see it happen. We can trust when Jesus says something in the New Testament. We can trust His words. We can trust His promises. The historicist, the struggle against the world and the enemy will continue until Jesus returns, and we should be equipped for this battle. Even if it doesn't happen in our generation, we should equip the next. And this readiness should continue until Christ returns. The battle doesn't begin in the tribulation. It's happening now. Some reject Christ and others run to Him. The world still persecutes believers to this very day. The idealist, the conflict between believers and the enemy of Christ will continue to the very end of the current world. Some Christians hold on to Jesus while others reject or fall away from Him. The believer must engage the conflict. James would call us to keep ourselves from being polluted by the world. And then finally, the futurist. That while the tribulation is a dark time, our hope is that when the lights of the universe shut off, the light of Christ will shine. And we believe Him and we trust Him. That even when the struggles of life escalate, we understand that at the darkest moment, Jesus will be seen by all, then everything changes. Get ready. We don't know if it's our generation or if we need to prepare our kids. And we can look at culture and see that some are asleep. Some are asleep. And some, it seems like no matter how hard you try, they won't wake up. But the invitation is this, is that when all the lights shut off and Christ returns, everything will be worth it. No one will question what they've been through. That's the promise for the believer. That's the promise for someone who has hope in Jesus. Amen? Will you pray with me?